There is a pattern in history that repeats with such precision it becomes almost impossible to ignore once you finally train your eyes to see it. But seeing the pattern isn't the hard part. The hard part is having the emotional stomach to act on it when everyone else around you, your friends, your business partners, even your own family, is calling you paranoid. In the quiet months leading up to World War I, while most of Europe was enjoying the peak of a golden age that people thought would last forever, certain families were quietly liquidating land holdings that had been in their names for generations. They weren't just selling property. They were selling their history, their roots, and their sense of belonging because they felt a shift in the wind that others dismissed as a breeze. They were converting prestigious, immovable assets into forms of wealth that could simply disappear into a coat pocket or be transferred across a border in the middle of the night, realizing that a castle is a cage if the gates are locked from the outside. Before the Russian Revolution, while the aristocrats in St. Petersburg were busy adding to their grand estates and buying more silver to decorate tables that would soon be overturned, a different group, those who understood that a title is only as good as the government that honors it, was already moving their life's work into neutral jurisdictions, choosing anonymity over prestige. And again, before the rise of the Third Reich, when most Germans were buying into the intoxicating hope of economic recovery and national pride, specific families were already gone. Their businesses were sold at a heartbreaking loss. Their wealth was transformed into something untraceable, and they vanished while the exit doors were still wide open and the sun was still shining, leaving behind neighbors who would later wonder how they knew. This wasn't prophecy, and these families weren't reading tea leaves or consulting mystics. They were simply reading signals that everyone else dismissed as noise, political theater, or temporary madness. They had developed a system for acting on those signals that was refined over centuries of forced migrations, ghettos, and survival, where the cost of being wrong was total. What they did with their money before the cannons started firing reveals a method of threat assessment that makes modern geopolitical analysis look primitive and naive, because it wasn't based on spreadsheets, but on the raw understanding of human nature and state power. The common explanation people give today, the one that makes us feel better about our own lack of preparation, is that these families had inside information or special connections that warned them of coming disasters. We want to believe that because it gives us an excuse, telling us that we couldn't have done the same thing because we aren't connected, when in reality, that is a comfortable lie we tell ourselves to avoid the burden of responsibility. What they actually had was a framework for evaluating political risk that didn't rely on governments telling the truth or newspapers reporting accurately. They watched completely different indicators than everyone else and had the discipline to act on warning signs that seemed outright insane to their neighbors. A merchant in Berlin in 1935 didn't need secret intelligence to know the air was changing. He didn't need a spy in the Reichstag. He simply needed to trust patterns over propaganda, history over hope, and immediate, painful action over the seductive trap of waiting for certainty, which is the most dangerous state of mind a person can hold during a crisis. The first signal they watched was the appearance of legal restrictions presented under the guise of fairness, transparency, or public safety, which is the most subtle trap of all because it appeals to our desire for order. Whenever a government starts passing laws that single out any specific group for special regulation, even laws that seem minor, administrative, or even reasonable on the surface, families following this system begin their preparations because they know that the law is the primary weapon of the state. It doesn't matter if the laws are pitched as a necessary reform for the greater good. The historical pattern is cold and absolute. Once a government establishes the legal framework to treat one group differently, the expansion of those powers into total confiscation is inevitable. Think about a law requiring the registration of businesses owned by a specific minority. It is always presented as a move toward transparency or market integrity. But what it actually does is create a digital or physical database for future seizure. They recognized this pattern because they'd seen it play out across different countries and different centuries. They knew that by the time the general public realizes the danger, the legal infrastructure for the theft is already built, and the cage is locked. Before World War II, This sequence played out with mathematical predictability as professional restrictions came first, with lawyers and doctors losing the right to practice their crafts under the frame of protecting professionals from unfair competition. Most people, including many in the targeted community, thought this was a temporary madness. Unfortunate, yes, but surely something they could weather. But the families who understood historical patterns saw it differently. They knew that if the government could take your profession today, they would take your property tomorrow, your freedom the day after, and eventually, your life. The sequence was predictable, so they acted immediately, selling businesses at massive, heartbreaking losses rather than waiting for better prices that history told them would never come. The second signal they tracked was the rise of economic scapegoating in political rhetoric. Because whenever politicians start blaming the nation's economic problems on a specific group instead of their own policy failures, the clock has already started ticking. It doesn't even matter if the scapegoating is directed at you specifically. The pattern shows that economic scapegoating is the psychological foundation for confiscation, as a government that tells its population that their struggles are caused by a minority hoarding wealth is building the moral justification to steal that wealth. Once the public believes a group is responsible for their suffering, they will not only allow the state to take from that group, they will demand it, making it politically popular and even morally justified in the public mind to redistribute what was stolen. Before every major conflict, you see this escalation where economic hardship creates political pressure, and politicians deflect from their own failures by identifying villains. Whether it was Jewish bankers in Weimar Germany, the kulaks in Soviet Russia, or wealthy landowners in Cuba, the specific target changes, but the engine of the theft is identical, and families who recognize this didn't wait to see if they would be the next ones on the list, because they understood that once the fire of scapegoating is lit, the list of targets always expands. Today, it's one group. Tomorrow, it's anyone with a significant bank account. So they moved, diversifying across borders and shifting from assets that required government permission to assets they could control directly. The third red alert was always currency manipulation and capital controls. When a government starts interfering with the normal exchange of currency or imposing restrictions on moving money across borders, it is an immediate signal that the trap is being set. The public explanation is always economic stability or preventing speculation. But the real function is trapping wealth inside the country so it can be taxed, inflated, or seized later. Governments preparing for conflict need resources, and the easiest resources to grab are the ones that are physically and legally unable to escape. Capital controls usually start as temporary emergency measures, but they almost always become permanent and then expand. And the rule for these families was simple. At the first sign of capital controls, move everything you can immediately, even if the exchange rate feels like a total robbery. The fourth signal they watched for was the deadly combination of inflation and price controls, which is economically illiterate but politically brilliant, and always precedes a massive wealth transfer. Governments inflate the currency to fund their spending, causing prices to rise, and then impose price controls to hide the inflation they created, which destroys the ability of businesses to operate because their costs are rising while their revenue is frozen by law. This failure is actually a political opportunity, as when the business starts to collapse, the government blames the owner for mismanagement or hoarding, and then seizes the business for the public good, a pattern that accelerated before the Russian Revolution and in Germany between the wars. The families who recognized this didn't try to operate businesses through price controls. They sold before the controls made their businesses unsellable, prioritizing preservation over the false hope that the government would fix what it was intentionally breaking. The underlying principle in all of this is that governments follow predictable patterns when they are preparing to confiscate wealth, and these patterns start months or even years before the actual confiscation happens. By the time the seizure occurs, it is too late to act. But in the early stages, most people dismiss the signals because acting on them requires an immediate, painful sacrifice, like selling a home at a bad price or leaving behind a business you worked decades to build. The families who preserved wealth through catastrophes had a different relationship with uncertainty. They accepted that acting too early was infinitely better than acting too late, even if it meant sometimes appearing foolish or taking unnecessary losses. It is better to leave a country before persecution starts and look paranoid than to stay until persecution makes leaving impossible, meaning you have to be willing to be wrong. You can recover from leaving unnecessarily, but you cannot recover from staying too long, which is the asymmetry of survival. If you act on a warning and the disaster doesn't come, you still have your wealth and your freedom. You can rebuild, but if you ignore the warning and the disaster does come, you lose everything. This created a wealth protection philosophy based on maintaining multiple citizenship options, keeping assets in multiple jurisdictions, and holding wealth in portable, universal forms while building skills that work anywhere in the world. All of this insurance costs money and reduces your returns during stable periods, but it ensures that you survive the unstable ones. These families didn't think in terms of maximizing profit. They thought in terms of avoiding catastrophic loss, knowing that an acceptable loss is selling at 70% value to get out, while a catastrophic loss is staying for 100% and getting zero. What makes this framework so relevant now is that these same patterns are becoming visible in multiple parts of the world today. The question isn't whether the signals are there. The question is whether you have the discipline to trust the history you just learned more than the comfort of your current routine, and whether you are willing to endure the judgment of the normal world to ensure the survival of your legacy. When you look at the modern landscape, you see the same digital traces of the old physical traps: increased surveillance of financial transactions, the gradual phase-out of physical cash, and the rise of central bank digital currencies. These are the modern equivalents of the professional registrations and property lists of the 1930s. The families who survived the past wouldn't be comforted by the convenience of these systems. They would be terrified by the lack of an exit. They would be looking for the coat pocket assets of the 21st century, things that are outside the system, globally recognized, and easily transportable. They would be looking at jurisdictions that have historically respected the rule of the law over political expediency. They would be diversifying their physical presence as much as their financial one. The history of wealth is not just a history of accumulation, it is a history of evasion. The evasion of tyranny and the evasion of the mob. To connect with this history is to realize that the stability we feel today is an anomaly, not the rule. Most of human history is a story of upheaval, and the people who thrived were those who prepared for it while the weather was still fair. They didn't wait for the storm to break to start building the boat. They started at the first drop of rain, even when the sky was mostly blue. This mindset requires a fundamental shift in how you view your relationship with the state and your community. It requires you to acknowledge that, in a crisis, the state will prioritize its own survival over your rights every single time. It requires you to be okay with being the outlier, the one who isn't all in on the local economy. It is a lonely path, but it is the only one that leads through the fire. As we move forward into an era of increasing global tension and economic realignment, the signals are flashing brighter than they have in decades. You can choose to see them as noise or temporary madness, or you can choose to see them for what they are, the opening chapters of a story that has been told 1,000 times before. The ending of that story for you and your family depends entirely on whether you have the courage to act on what you now know.